the story has got a long, long history. So maybe 20 years ago, a little under 20 years ago, I went into work at Goldsmiths College in London, and there was a letter from a publisher saying that they want to publish a 50,000 word discussion, a conversation with Stuart Hall about his life and ideas. And would I be interested in doing this with him? Which of course I was. And so Stuart and I met, and we arranged that we'd have 4 interviews, maybe of an hour and a half each or something like that. So a year or 2 later, when we had the time, we did the interviews. I spent a summer transcribing them. And they came out to more or less 45,000 words. So we had the book kind of there. And I said to Stuart, well, there are still half a dozen questions which we need to address, otherwise the book isn't kind of complete. And I wrote down the questions, and I said, we can either meet for another half hour or hour and have the discussion, have the conversation, or you can tap away and do it yourself. He said, yeah, well, let me think about it. And then what happened, he got involved in the founding of Rivington Place and raising huge amounts of money for this art centre. So that was a big, big time-consuming project, which really took a lot of his energy over many years. And all the time he was involved in a million other things, in politics and the black arts and so on. So he wasn't able to give this project a lot of concentration. But periodically he'd get back to it, and then towards the end of his life, maybe 3 or 4 years before he died, he became more housebound. He wasn't able to go on the political stump and go and speak to classes or to political meetings. And he began to concentrate and work very hard on this manuscript. And his body was failing, and he was in pain, and he couldn't sleep, and he was taking lots of drugs. But he pressed on, he really pressed on. And his eyesight was going bad, so he could barely see the screen. He had to have a massive, great computer screen, and he'd do everything in 24 or 36 font. So what that meant was that he could never really read what he had written the day before or the day before that, because all he could see was this bit of the screen which he was working on at the time. But he persevered, and then whenever I went round, he would talk about this or about that. He would ask me questions, and sometimes parts of the manuscript would pass back and forth, and we'd both work on it and so forth. And then when he died, there was this colossal manuscript of 300,000 words, which is it's a huge, huge thing. Stuart was very keen indeed that this book should be a single volume, because he wanted the memoir and the memoir dimension of it, which is kind of the first half, and the kind of politics and the theory, all to be as an integrated text. And it was also kept in dialogic form. It was a conversation. And that's how he imagined this book to be, that he was determined that it should remain a conversation. And I think that's how, when he was writing himself, he was imagining it as a conversation. So he was asking questions. And then he would sometimes put a gap, Bill, ask a question here or something like that, But it's how he thought. He just thought dialogically. So that was the origins of this book, of the published memoir, which has just come out. I'm afraid that Stuart had died before we made contact with a new publisher. We were very keen indeed that the book shouldn't be published as an academic book in the United Kingdom, but as a more popular trade book. So we approached Penguin, and it became very clear early on, we just heard through the grapevine, that no trade publisher would publish a conversation. And I don't understand that, because if you think of TV interviews and so on, they are part of popular life, the interview. But it became clear that no publisher was going to contemplate the idea of publishing a book based on a conversation or an interview. So we met with Penguin, with Tom Penn, a very, very committed publisher, politically committed, very enthusiastic that he was publishing Stuart Hall's work, and a very smart man, a very good man. And he just said, it has to be turned into the first person singular. This has to be a first person narrative in Stuart Hall's voice. Well, maybe that's so in the abstract, but it does involve, or it did involve, a new process of mediation, because Stuart Hall wasn't there to talk in the first person singular. So requiring me to turn everything into first person singular kind of took the story away from the immediacy of Stuart Hall's voice, when it was meant to be doing exactly the opposite. But in the end, I became reconciled to this, and I think Catherine Hall became reconciled to it. And it's partly because I'd talked for so many years with Stuart Hall about this book, and his voice was so much inside me that I got to the point where I couldn't quite remember what was his voice and what was my voice. There was just such a kind of intermingling in this. And it was possible at some point to reconstruct Stuart Hall's voice in a way which I think wasn't damaging to him. I say a little bit about this in the introduction, just to warn readers that this cannot be the pure voice of Stuart Hall. What the pure voice of Stuart Hall would ever be and how we could access that, I don't know. But it's there just to warn people that this is a kind of, it is a construction of Stuart Hall's voice. Yeah, but I'm happy with it ethically, and I think it has a certain degree of accuracy. I'm even tempted to say a certain degree of authenticity. That it's close enough. It's close enough to Stuart Hall's voice. So that's how it came to be. Catherine and I became reconciled very quickly indeed to the idea that we had to go against Stuart's wishes and not publish the entire manuscript, where the theory and the politics and the memoir was all there in 300,000 words. No publisher would have ever dreamt of being able to publish such a volume. So, on the grounds that we wanted this book to have as wide a distribution as possible, we went against his wishes, and thought we'd publish the memoir separately from the work, which is really the analytical work, which is really in this manuscript, is really about the relationship between culture. It's how you think the relationship between culture and politics. So that was one big decision we had to make, that in practical terms, the only way this could be a book which was widely distributed was to separate the memoir from the more philosophical questions. How would Stuart have imagined this book being produced not as a conversation? I think he would have felt edgy about it, as Catherine Hall and myself felt edgy about it at first. And I can imagine him, smiling, shaking his head a little bit and saying, it shouldn't really be like that. It's a compromise we made in order to ensure that the book could be distributed. And I did lose sleep about it at some points early on, and then I thought, this is a decision we made, let's go with it. And I don't feel too bad at all. You do ask an interesting question. How would Stuart have thought about this script if he had read it? Well, I don't know. The one thing I do know is that Stuart could not and would not agree with everything which is actually down there on the page, even though a ton of it, most of it, 98% of it is Stuart. It comes directly from Stuart. But he was a thinker who was absolutely committed to fine distinctions in thinking about politics, thinking about culture, thinking about lives and so on. And whether it's been possible to get those fine distinctions exactly as he'd wished, I think it won't have been so. There'll be times when he'd shake his head and say, oh, no, Bill. No. But on the whole, I think we've got as close as we possibly could. And I'm very pleased with the script, actually, in the end. I think it works. This book would have never been finished as long as Stuart Hall was alive. He could never have put the last full stop. Because he couldn't have imagined his life being finished like that. That he could finally write the last sentence where everything would be tied up and complete and organised, and that would be it. And he couldn't do that because he kept on changing his mind every day about things he'd been writing about 50 years ago. He changed his mind. Things he was writing about last week, he changed his mind. That unfinished nature was integral to the way he thought, both politically and conceptually. The unfinishedness was absolutely crucial to the making of the manuscript. And it was not in him to have put the final full stop, press the button, sent it off, and then gone and made a cup of tea and think, well, that's good. He couldn't do it. He couldn't do it. So we have to finish what Stuart Hall psychically and intellectually himself refused to finish. Organising the book was difficult. As I've indicated, Stuart wanted this entire manuscript to be published in one piece, whole. It was divided up into maybe 5 chapters, which would have meant that each chapter was about 60,000 words, so each chapter would be a small book. Well, it wasn't a very reader-friendly way of organising a book. And it became very difficult that where Stuart, in his final years, was at his most luminous and his most insightful was actually in the detailed formulations. And he, even when he was in great pain and not sleeping and so on, he could still craft these fabulous, fabulous sentences and paragraphs. What he was less capable of doing towards the end was seeing the entire manuscript as an integrated whole, or even each chapter as an integrated whole. So what didn't really exist was the details of the conceptual organisation which made the book, or the books, readable. The Stuart, clearly in his own mind, he could see the shape, the broad shape, the grand shape of what this manuscript was going to look like. But that intermediate level between knowing what the grand narrative was going to be, and then connecting that to the kind of luminous particular insights which kept on arriving more and more on every page. There was a kind of mismatch between the overall structure and what he was doing on the page at the time. And that's really where the bulk of the editing had to take place, was making clear what was unspoken in Stuart Hall's text about the conceptual progression of each passage and so on. And that's what took the time, really. And it was necessary at every point for me to pass to Catherine Hall, his widow, the draft, so Catherine could see what was happening. Because I should say that although whenever I met Stuart Hall in the last years, we would talk incessantly about the manuscript. But that was only part of the conversation he was having. That every day he and Catherine talked about this script. So she was able to know very closely indeed the kind of directions, the trajectories of Stuart Hall's thoughts, page by page. She kind of had that idea. So in conversation, she and I were able to kind of assemble how we thought they should be. It has been a very taxing experience, both in terms of time and labour, preparing the manuscript, but it's also been taxing emotionally, because essentially for the 2 years or however long it was, which I was involved in preparing the manuscript, the first part of the manuscript for publication, I was in daily conversation with Stuart. And I was, for a year this time, I was at a wonderful, wonderful research centre in North Carolina, the National Humanities Centre. And there were 30 fellows there, this little building on the edge of a forest, very, very beautiful. And we'd all arrive at breakfast time, have breakfast, and then go off to our respective studies to do whatever research we were doing. And some people were working on, fragments of Assyrian manuscripts, others on, the concept of the individual and the ego in Cartesian philosophy. And all of us were talking to these historic figures, whether it's Descartes or Hegel or however, we were all in conversation. The difference I had was that I was in conversation. It was necessarily a more intimate conversation because I could hear the voice. I knew the living soul of Stuart Hall. And there are times it just got too much. And But that is, I've always believed, that is kind of what historians do, and I regard myself at least half and half as a historian, is we talk with the dead. We find some way of talking with the dead. That we endeavour to continue that conversation. We endeavour to keep that dialogue alive. The difficulty is that when we're having that conversation, we ask the questions and we have to provide the answers. So there are no Stuart Hall answers. He can't hear the questions. He doesn't know what we're asking. So it is the fact of death that it is up to us to somehow craft the answers which we might have expected or that we would wish. And they may come back to us as the voice of Stuart Hall, but that is a kind of ventriloquism. They are not. They are our projections, and we have to take responsibility for our own projections, even when we realise that they are indeed projections. That is part of the deal. It's interesting. It is a continuing kind of impossible conversation. I mean, I do have this fantasy of Stuart buried in Highgate Cemetery with Karl Marx around the corner, many of his old comrades buried within hailing distance. Comrades going back for his entire political life, from the 1950s to the 21st century. Every one of whom Stuart had argued with, and with whom Stuart continued to argue with. So I have this fantasy that when the gates close on the cemetery, all the old Marxist comrades engage in this kind of huge, unruly kind of Marxist sleepover, and they start discussing, when the living leave the cemetery, and they start discussing the nature of the falling rate of pop profit, or the state of, what kind of state is China, and what is the fate of socialism in the 21st century. And Stuart, unlike many of the comrades who are buried there in the cemetery, Stuart is at some remove from the shadow of Karl Marx. He didn't want to be that proximate, but nor did he want to be entirely separate. So it sums up for me Stuart's own relationship to Marxism. He was always absolutely in conversation with Marxism. He could never let it go. Towards the end of his life, the energies which Marxism had released in him, I think, accumulated so that he was moving back onto that train, especially after 2008, the great financial collapse and so on, that those Marxist issues kept pressing in on him and became more and more important. But at the same time, Stuart treasured his obliqueness, his distance from Marxism, his need to construct his own reading and his own contemporary reading of what Marx was about and how we should think about Marxism and how it could possibly be used for the present. And in that respect, he was always very keen indeed to hear younger voices who wouldn't have regarded themselves as Marxists at all, radical in their own way, inhabiting a different sort of new generational radicalism, which wasn't Stuart's. But he was alert to that and intrigued by that and wanted to know more and to revise his own Marxism, if that's what it was, or Marxist thinking, I don't know, in the light of current preoccupations. So although I rather like this image, this fantasy, it's my fantasy, this fantasy of this great Marxist sleepover with the old comrades, there would have also been a time when Stuart tired of it. He would have tired of hearing the same old voices rehearsing the same old arguments. Others would have got tired of hearing Stuart because they knew exactly where Stuart was coming from. He knew exactly where they were coming from. And so I like to think of him maybe just turning over and just looking at the stars, looking at the night sky and thinking, well, what will the future behold?